Softly now, let yourself settle into stillness. Let your breathing grow slow and easy, your body heavy and warm. Tonight, we travel gently back through the long corridors of time, back to ancient lands where rivers whispered between reeds, where scribes pressed careful marks into wet clay beneath the light of stars older than memory. There is nothing you need to do. Simply listen and let the world drift quietly away. The very first whispers of the Sebitti reach us through the crumbling, incomplete clay tablets of the old Babylonian era. Fragile remnants of a civilization that regarded these beings with a reverence shadowed unmistakably by fear. These ancient inscriptions, etched somewhere between the years 2000 and 600 before the Common Era, do not describe the seven as creations of the orderly divine hierarchy that shaped Mesopotamian religious thought. Instead, they speak of entities born from the formless void that existed before creation had taken its first breath. Imagine, if you will, the quiet of a world not yet made. No rivers, no reed beds, no whisper of wind across open water. Only darkness, and within that darkness, something ancient and patient, waiting. The Akkadian word Sebitti appears with quiet persistence across astronomical treatises and incantation texts alike, hinting at a double nature, part celestial phenomenon, part supernatural force of ruin. Even within the Enuma Elish, though the seven are never named directly in its great creation narrative, allusions to seven winds and seven demons of the storm point unmistakably toward their primordial roots. That foundational text describes how, before the god Marduk imposed his vision of cosmic order upon the universe, forces of boundless chaos moved freely and without constraint. Among those ancient presences, the seven occupied a position unlike any other. They belonged neither to the churning disorder of Tiamat's realm, nor to the structured and carefully negotiated world of the divine assembly that would gradually take shape. They existed instead as something in between, instruments of a divine will that reached beyond the ordinary boundaries of cosmic law and that answered to no power but one. There is something almost hypnotic about the way these ancient tablets preserve such knowledge. The careful grooves pressed into damp clay by patient hands, the same hands that would have looked up on clear nights to find the Pleiades hanging in the dark, cool and remote, their light traveling distances the mind can barely hold. The scribes who wrote these things lived and died and were forgotten, but their marks remained, waiting in the dark beneath the earth for thousands of years, patient as the seven themselves. The connection between the Sebitti and the sky god Anu becomes clear through slow and patient study of the astronomical texts known as the three ways of Anu, Enlil, and Ea. These remarkable documents, which served the dual purpose of celestial maps and priestly guides, placed the seven firmly within Anu's heavenly domain. Anu, the primordial god of the sky, whose authority stretched back even beyond Marduk's ascendancy, fashioned the Sebitti as his own personal agents of enforcement. Where other divine beings were bound by the collective decisions of the pantheon, obligated by shared oaths and mutual agreements, the seven stood apart. They answered only to Anu, and to Anu alone. Even the Anunnaki, those great gods who administered the known world, could neither command nor restrain them. This independence was not merely unusual, it was absolute. The identification of the Sebitti with the Pleiades star cluster reveals just how sophisticated the cosmological thinking of Mesopotamian scholars truly was. The Pleiades, visible to the naked eye as a compact gathering of 7 luminous stars, served as an essential marker in the agricultural calendar, and carried deep theological significance. In the astronomical compendium, known as the MUL.APIN, the cluster is recorded as MUL.MUL, literally Star of Stars, and is explicitly associated with the Sebitti. This association was far more than simple observation. The seven were understood to channel their power through their stellar counterparts, their earthly interventions rising and falling in correspondence with the cluster's position across the dome of the night sky. The Pleiades became, in this way, both a clock and a warning bell. Picture a Babylonian astronomer on a rooftop terrace in the deep of night, wrapped against the chill, a clay tablet beside him, a reed stylus held loosely in practiced fingers. He tilts his face upward and finds the cluster without effort, as one finds the face of someone known all one's life. He notes its angle above the horizon, its brightness, the faint shimmering of its light through layers of cool air. He marks the observation carefully. He has done this for 30 years. His father did it before him. His measurements will outlast every wall of the city by 3,000 years. The seasonal appearances and disappearances of that star cluster gave Mesopotamian astronomers a kind of cosmic timepiece. Yet it was also something more sobering, a system of celestial signals. When the cluster reached certain critical positions, particularly during its heliacal rising in the late weeks of spring, priests understood this as a sign that the seven were stirring, making ready for action. Cuneiform tablets from the Neo-Assyrian period preserve detailed records of elaborate rituals performed at precisely these astronomically significant moments, ceremonies designed either to invoke the seven's power or to soften their attention. Their continued prominence in religious practice across centuries speaks to how deeply they had settled into the spiritual consciousness of Mesopotamian civilization. What set the Sebitti apart from every other divine entity was the particular nature of their function. While gods like Nergal and Ereshkigal ruled the underworld and its dead, while other deities commanded storms and controlled the rising of floodwaters, the seven moved within none of these established domains. They were called upon only when the conventional powers of the assembled gods had proven themselves insufficient. Cuneiform texts speak of them as weapons that know no mercy and forces that strike without warning. Language that underscores their role not as governors of a particular realm, but as ultimate enforcers of a justice that recognized no appeal. The creation of the Sebitti by Anu reflected one of the deepest principles woven through Mesopotamian theology, that there must exist forces beyond the reach of cosmic politics. The Anunnaki, despite their considerable authority, were bound by divine assemblies and collective deliberations, entangled in webs of obligation and mutual influence. The seven were free of all this. Operating directly under Anu's authority, they were immune to interference from every other god in the pantheon. Once Anu set them in motion, no deity could predict their path or slow their progress. This made them both supremely useful and deeply, profoundly terrifying. Archaeological finds at Babylon and Nineveh have uncovered cylinder seals and stone relief carvings depicting 7 identical warrior figures advancing in perfect formation. These images are remarkably consistent across different periods and locations. The Sebitti appear always as armored beings, weapons identical in their hands, faces hidden behind helmets or ceremonial masks. Their uniformity in art is deliberate and meaningful. They were not conceived as individuals with distinct personalities, but as a single devastating principle expressed 7 times simultaneously. Even the stone itself, worn smooth at the edges by thousands of years, seems to hold something of their stillness. 7 figures in perfect formation, going nowhere, waiting for everything. careful linguistic study of the word Sebitti uncovers meanings that extend far beyond a simple number. The Akkadian root sap carries associations of completeness and wholeness, while the attached suffix invokes plurality with unmistakable divine weight. The 7, in this construction, represent not merely a group of 7 separate beings, but the total embodiment of a specific order of divine force, a wholeness of destruction made plural and manifest. The word appears across Mesopotamian literature in subtly shifting forms. Sebitti in Akkadian, Sebitti in Babylonian dialect, Sebitti in Assyrian inscriptions, each variation carrying its own nuance of meaning, yet all pointing towards the same terrifying essential nature. When we turn to neighboring civilizations, we find that the pattern of 7 divine agents appears with striking regularity across the ancient world, suggesting either shared origins or the kind of deep cultural transmission that accompanied trade and diplomacy. The Hurrian pantheon recognized 7 storm gods known as the Tub 7. Ugaritic religious texts described 7 divine warriors who fought alongside the storm god Baal against monsters of chaos. The Hebrew scriptures speak of 7 spirits of God and 7 angels who stand before the divine throne. Such parallels suggest that the concept of 7 coordinated divine agents spread outward from its Mesopotamian wellspring to water the religious traditions of many neighboring cultures. The Egyptian traditions of the 7 Hathors and the 7 scorpion goddesses who guarded Isis follow comparable structural patterns. Though in Egypt, such groupings typically perform protective and nurturing functions, a marked contrast to the purely martial and destructive character of the Mesopotamian 7. Persian sources from the Achaemenid period describe 7 divine warriors called the Amesha Spentas, who served Ahura Mazda as forces of light and order rather than instruments of wrath. Another example of how the septenary pattern adapted itself to the specific theological requirements of each culture that inherited it. The underlying structure remained. The purpose and character shifted. It is worth pausing here for a moment, in the quiet of the night, to feel the weight of this. 7 cultures, 7 traditions, 7 ways of looking at the sky, and finding the same compact cluster of stars and understanding, each in their own way, that something of consequence resided there. The stars themselves changed nothing. They burned on, indifferent and ancient, as they do still tonight above you. And yet, generation after generation of human beings looked up at them and felt the same stirring of something enormous and unnamed. The role of the Sebitti, as forces beyond conventional divine intervention, becomes most vivid in texts that describe moments of genuine cosmic crisis. When Tiamat threatened to unravel the ordered universe in the Enuma Elish, the established gods found themselves inadequate to the challenge, until Marduk stepped forward as champion. Yet other, perhaps earlier versions of this mythological tradition suggest that Anu had contemplated unleashing the 7 as his ultimate answer to the Chaos Dragon. The fact that he ultimately chose instead to elevate Marduk speaks to how extreme a measure the Sebitti represented. They were a solution so final, so absolute, that even desperate gods hesitated to employ them. This reluctance runs as a quiet thread through Mesopotamian religious literature. The Sebitti were not deities invoked for ordinary human concerns, fertility, prosperity, protection from common illness, nor were they worshipped through the regular rhythms of temple life. They remained held in reserve, poised at the outer edge of divine possibility. Their position in the cosmic order resembled, in some ways, a catastrophic last resort. A force to be deployed only when existence itself faced an existential threat. This understanding explains why even the Anunnaki, for all their own tremendous power, regarded the seven with something approaching dread. The weaponry associated with the Sebitti transcended anything found in the conventional armaments of divine warfare. Cuneiform tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal describe their primary instrument using the Akkadian term shutubu, a word that resists precise translation, but appears to describe a force capable of undoing established order at its foundations. Unlike the thunderbolt of Adad or the sacred bow of Ninurta, crafted objects imbued with divine power, the weapons of the seven were not things that had been made. They were manifestations of primordial chaos given form and direction. The Enuma Elish alludes to 7 instruments of terror held in reserve by Anu, even as Marduk assembled his conventional divine arsenal. These weapons are described using the Akkadian adjective shutu, those which cause trembling, suggesting that they inspired existential dread not merely in mortals, but in divine beings themselves. Neo-Babylonian cylinder seals depict the Sebitti carrying distinctive crescent-shaped weapons that emit what appear to be rays or tongues of flame. The artistic representations are consistent across time and region. The weapons appear not as objects held in hand, but as extensions of the warrior's own essence, emanating from their very being. Comparative study with Assyrian palace reliefs reveals the same iconographic patterns. Weapons that pulse with interior energy, warriors standing in perfectly synchronized formation, individual combat style subordinated entirely to collective precision. There is a strange peace in contemplating these ancient images. These 7 figures carved into stone or impressed into clay, standing in their eternal formation, their weapons glowing with a light that no human eye will ever see directly. They existed in stories told by firelight, in prayers whispered before dawn, in the careful marks of scribes who understood that what they were recording was older than any city, older than any king. Let that oldness settle gently over you now, like silt drifting down through still water, like the slow accumulation of centuries. The capacity of the seven to manifest as celestial phenomena was perhaps their most awe-inspiring quality. Babylonian astronomical texts from the Seleucid period describe specific instances in which the Sebitti descended from their stellar positions to intervene directly in the affairs of the living world. The text, known as the Chronicle of the Seven Stars, records an event during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, when the Pleiades cluster appeared to descend toward the earth during a severe outbreak of plague. Records from the same era describe 7 comets appearing simultaneously in the night sky, an observation interpreted as evidence that the Sebitti could manifest their presence across multiple celestial bodies at once. The ancient Mesopotamians understood the seven as beings capable of moving freely between stellar, atmospheric, and earthly forms of expression. Cuneiform tablets from the Neo-Assyrian period describe them arriving as 7 winds carrying the breath of death, while simultaneously preserving their identity as warrior stars. This multidimensional existence allowed them to strike through disasters that appeared entirely random to ordinary human observation, but which followed precise divine targeting. Meteorological records preserved in the astronomical diaries of Babylon document repeated correlations between unusual atmospheric conditions and the ritual activities associated with the Sebitti. During periods when priests performed specific incantations invoking the seven, scribes recorded abnormal storm systems, unexpected shifts in temperature, and atmospheric disturbances that seem to originate from the direction of the Pleiades. These observations suggest that ancient Mesopotamians possessed a remarkably sophisticated understanding of how cosmic forces could express themselves through terrestrial phenomena. an understanding that blurred the boundary between religious interpretation and empirical meteorological observation. The independence of the Sebitti from the normal workings of divine governance becomes most clearly visible in their capacity to act without consultation or approval from the assembled gods. Standard Mesopotamian theological texts describe elaborate divine councils in which major decisions required the consensus of the Anunnaki, even for Marduk himself. The Code of Hammurabi references these assemblies as forums where gods sought collective approval before implementing significant changes in the order of things. The seven, however, stood entirely outside this system. Once Anu activated them, they pursued their objectives with the mechanical certainty of celestial bodies following their orbits, immune to appeals, indifferent to offerings, impervious to the negotiations and interventions of every other deity. This autonomy expressed itself in an unusual command structure. While other divine armies organized themselves hierarchically, generals, lieutenants, specialized roles and ranks, the Sebitti functioned as a perfect collective. Cuneiform descriptions consistently employ singular grammatical forms when referring to all seven simultaneously, despite their plural nature, suggesting that ancient writers perceived them as facets of a single overwhelming force rather than as seven distinct individuals. The term Shutubwesten, the one overturner, appears in ritual texts when addressing the seven as a unified entity, further underscoring their conception as a single destructive principle with seven expressions rather than seven beings with independent wills. The Epic of Era provides the most detailed surviving account of the Sebitti's deployment against humanity, revealing the systematic and carefully graduated nature of their destructive capacities. Unlike divine punishments that targeted specific cities or particular groups, the seven implemented comprehensive campaigns of devastation that moved across entire regions through coordinated application of multiple catastrophes. The epic describes their methodology with something almost resembling precision. First, the corruption of agricultural cycles through unseasonable weather and the contamination of soil. Second, the introduction of epidemic diseases that spread rapidly through both human and animal populations. And third, the deliberate inflaming of existing tensions between city-states and tribal groups until warfare became inevitable. The plague-bringing function of the Sebitti receives particular attention in the medical incantation texts of the Neo-Babylonian period. These specialized documents describe 7 distinct categories of epidemic disease, each associated with one of the 7 and each requiring its own distinct therapeutic approach. The Ashipu texts, used by exorcist priests in healing ceremonies, name specific ailments: Shimatu, Sasatu, Benu, Shebu, Lamashtu, Labasu, and Mukal Resh Limutim. Each disease required different therapeutic approaches, but all were understood as manifestations of the Sebitti channeled through biological agents. Military historians studying these ancient texts have noted, with some astonishment, how the descriptions of coordinated disease outbreaks and their integration with broader social disruption reflect an understanding of epidemiological principles not formally recognized by modern science until the 19th century. The timing of pathogen introduction, the targeting of specific demographic groups, the use of illness as preparation for subsequent military intervention, all of this reflects a strategic understanding that reaches far beyond what one might expect from religious narrative. The famine-inducing capabilities of the Sebitti extended well beyond simple crop failure into the systematic disruption of entire agricultural ecosystems. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur describes their intervention during the fall of the Third Dynasty of Ur as causing simultaneous failures of grain crops, date palms, and livestock reproduction, all despite favorable weather conditions, as though the seven could disrupt biological processes directly rather than merely manipulating the natural environment. Soil analysis from archaeological sites associated with historically documented famines has revealed unusual mineral compositions that align with ancient textual descriptions of earth sickness. Samples recovered from the ruins of cities mentioned in the Epic of Error show elevated concentrations of heavy metals and salts that would have rendered agricultural land temporarily infertile. Natural explanations for such conditions exist, of course, yet the correlation with ancient textual accounts of the Sebitti's interventions invites questions that resist easy dismissal. The war-inducing function of the Seven operated not through direct military intervention, but through the subtler mechanism of psychological manipulation. Cuneiform tablets from the Neo-Assyrian royal archives describe their capacity to turn brother against brother and transform allies into enemies. Their method appears to have involved amplifying existing tensions and suspicions until diplomatic resolution became impossible, not creating conflict from nothing, but deepening fissures already present in human relationships until collapse became unavoidable. The Annals of Sargon II even reference consultation with specialists in Sebitti law before major military campaigns, suggesting that Assyrian rulers had developed practical understanding of when the seven might be active and how to avoid inadvertently drawing their attention. Ritualistic practices for managing the Sebitti's influence evolved over centuries into one of the most intricate branches of Mesopotamian religious technology. The MUL series, comprising 8 tablets of anti-witchcraft incantation, includes specific procedures for warding against the Seven's destructive power. These rituals required precise astronomical timing, specialized materials including meteoric iron and water drawn from 7 distinct sources, and the participation of priests trained in the dangerous and highly specialized art of Sebitti binding. The most effective protective spells worked not by confronting the Seven directly, which would have been catastrophic, but by appealing to Anu's authority over his own creations. The incantation formula, Shutubulatashkan, let not the overturners be established, appears on numerous protective amulets and in inscriptions carved above doorways, recited at specific moments when the Pleiades occupied particular positions in the night sky. Apotropaic practices developed alongside these incantations to include the carving of 7 pointed star symbols into the foundations of buildings and the walls of cities. Archaeological excavations at Babylon have uncovered extensive networks of these protective symbols arranged in geometric configurations that correspond to the Pleiades constellation map. The symbols were often filled with mixtures of precious metals and organic materials, a combination that modern analysis suggests may have produced electromagnetic anomalies, which ancient practitioners believed capable of disrupting the Sebitti's ability to take physical form. Even more elaborate were the substitute target rituals, in which 7 identical clay figures were constructed to represent different aspects of a community requiring protection. These figures were then ceremonially destroyed in a specific sequence, with priests reciting formulas designed to redirect the Seven's violence toward these symbolic victims rather than toward living populations. Archaeological evidence suggests these practices continued well into the Hellenistic period, a remarkable persistence across centuries of political and cultural transformation. Let your mind rest there for a moment. In the quiet of a temple precinct at night, where priests move in slow procession between altars arranged in the shape of a constellation, their voices low and steady, their breath misting slightly in the cool air. The clay figures stand in a row, small and patient. The stars above occupy their ancient positions. Everything proceeds according to calculation, according to knowledge accumulated across generations. The world beyond the temple walls is dark and vast and very still. The complex hierarchical structure of the Mesopotamian pantheon, documented across thousands of cuneiform tablets, reveals a system of divine authority that governed every aspect of cosmic order with extraordinary precision. At its apex stood Anu, primordial god of the sky. Below him came Enlil, lord of atmosphere and earth, and Ea, master of the subterranean waters. Beneath these three ranged the Anunnaki, the great gods who administered the various domains of existence, from Marduk's kingship over the assembled pantheon to Inanna's dominion over love and war. Each deity possessed carefully defined spheres of influence, established through eons of divine politics, conflict, and negotiation. And yet within this meticulously organized structure existed a profound anomaly. The Sebitti answered to none but Anu, and even he could not fully control them once they had been set in motion. The Atrahasis epic provides the most revealing account of the divine fear this situation generated through its description of the assembly that decided humanity's fate. When the Anunnaki gathered to deliberate, the discussions were shadowed by deep anxiety about awakening forces beyond collective control. Enlil's frustration with conventional divine punishments, drought, famine, plague, becomes fully comprehensible only when read against the assembled gods' profound reluctance to employ more drastic measures. The eventual decision to flood the earth was not Enlil's first preference. It represented his desperate attempt to avoid invoking the Sebitti, whose intervention could have achieved the same result through methods that even the gods found abhorrent. Fragmentary tablets from the old Babylonian period preserve records of divine assemblies in which the mere mention of the Sebitti ignited heated debate among the Anunnaki. The text, designated as the Council of the Terrified Gods, describes a crisis during which Nergal, the fierce god of war and plague, argued strenuously against consulting Anu about deploying the Seven. His words, preserved in damaged cuneiform and translated approximately, read, "Better that we face defeat with honor than victory through the instruments that know no distinction between guilty and innocent." This statement, from one of the pantheon's most brutal deities, reveals the depth of moral and practical concern that the Sebitti inspired even among gods who were themselves fully accustomed to cosmic-scale destruction. The immunity of the Seven to traditional divine authority stemmed from the unique nature of their creation. Unlike other deities who came into being through divine reproduction, emanation, or elevation from lesser status, the Sebitti were forged directly from Anu's will during the primordial epoch, that early phase of existence when the boundaries between order and chaos remained fluid and undefined. Cuneiform texts from the Neo-Assyrian period describe this creative process using the term Shutubu Bananu, created as overturners, suggesting that they were designed specifically to function outside the normal constraints of divine operation, crafted for situations where conventional authority proved entirely insufficient. This primordial nature placed the Sebitti beyond every mechanism that governed other members of the pantheon. The Mesopotamian gods operated through networks of mutual obligation, shared authority, and collective decision-making. Deities could be bound by oaths, constrained by cosmic laws, held accountable by their peers. The Seven, however, existed in a state of permanent exception. Once activated by Anu, they pursued their assigned objectives with the relentless, impersonal precision of natural forces, immune to appeals from other gods, unmoved by offerings or diplomatic approaches, indifferent to whatever collateral damage they might inflict among divine or mortal populations. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh contains quiet references to this divine fear. When Ishtar witnesses the destruction wrought by the flood, her lament includes the telling phrase, "I did not speak for this in the assembly of the gods." The implication is that the decision had been made without full divine consensus. Her subsequent oath, never again to speak such words in the divine assembly, suggests the trauma experienced by deities who had witnessed destruction on a scale that even they found excessive. The flood, devastating as it was for all living things, had been a controlled alternative to the far worse outcome of unleashing forces that no god could afterward recall. Archaeological evidence from the Palace of Sargon II at Dur Sharukin reveals relief carvings depicting the king in consultation with priests specifically trained in Sebitti law before major military campaigns. These specialists, known as Barusha Ilu Sebitti, readers of the Sebitti's omens, possessed knowledge of how to determine when the seven were active and how to avoid inadvertently drawing their attention to one's own endeavors. The existence of such specialized advisors within the royal court demonstrates that even the most powerful earthly rulers understood the necessity of navigating carefully around the Sebitti sphere of influence. If mortal kings required expert guidance, the concerns of the gods themselves become far easier to understand. The specific episodes in which the Sebitti posed direct threats to divine order itself are preserved in fragmentary form across multiple ancient text traditions. The myth known as the Rebellious Stars describes an incident in which the seven allegedly turned against the established cosmic order. During a period of prolonged divine conflict, the Pleiades cluster allegedly began moving in patterns that violated astronomical law. Babylonian astronomers recorded these anomalous movements as evidence that the Sebitti were preparing to abandon their assigned positions within Anu's celestial domain. The crisis resolved only when Anu performed an elaborate ritual of renewed commitment, essentially renegotiating his relationship with his own creations, a remarkable admission of limitation for the god who had made them. The theological implications of this episode reach far beyond astronomical curiosity. If the seven could threaten to abandon their cosmic positions, they possessed a form of genuine agency that transcended even their creator's authority. This possibility terrified the Anunnaki because it suggested that the ultimate stability of cosmic order depended upon the continued cooperation of beings who owed no loyalty to the system they helped maintain. The gods had spent eons establishing order through careful balance of competing forces, but the existence of the Sebitti meant that this order rested at its deepest foundation upon something inherently uncertain. The Chronicle of Divine Disasters preserves accounts of 3 separate occasions when the Sebitti's interventions exceeded their intended scope, producing damage that alarmed even Anu himself. The first incident occurred during the destruction of the city of Akkad, where the Seven's plague-bringing function continued operating long after the targeted population had been eliminated. The diseases they had introduced began spreading to neighboring regions and even affected divine beings who had consumed offerings from contaminated areas. Only the direct intervention of Ninurta, employing weapons specifically designed to counter primordial forces, managed to contain the epidemic. The second recorded incident involved the Sebitti's role in the fall of the Third Dynasty of Ur. Historical records from this period describe a cascade of disasters that began with targeted famine but escalated into region-wide ecological collapse. The Seven's intervention disrupted not only human agriculture, but the natural cycles sustaining all life in southern Mesopotamia. Rivers shifted course. Soil composition altered at the chemical level. Even the behavior of wild animals became erratic and unpredictable. The scope of destruction suggested that the Sebitti had either exceeded their instructions or were operating according to parameters that Anu himself had not fully understood when he created them. The third incident, preserved in the most fragmentary condition of all, apparently involved direct confrontation between the Sebitti and other members of the pantheon. The text, known only through Neo-Babylonian copies of much earlier material, describes a conflict between the Sebitti and Marduk during his consolidation of supreme power over the assembled gods. Marduk, attempting to assert his authority as king of the gods, reportedly demanded that the seven formally acknowledge his supremacy. Their refusal precipitated a brief but terrifying conflict that ended only when Anu intervened to remind all parties of the established hierarchy. The very fact that such a confrontation could occur demonstrates the unique position of the Sebitti as the only divine beings who could challenge Marduk's authority without facing immediate annihilation. The psychological impact of these incidents upon the Anunnaki cannot easily be overstated. Gods who routinely commanded cosmic forces and reshaped reality through divine will found themselves confronted with beings who operated by principles they could neither comprehend nor influence. The Sebitti represented a form of power that existed entirely outside the carefully constructed framework of divine civilization. A reminder that beneath the ordered pantheon lay forces of primordial chaos that could never be fully domesticated. This existential anxiety expressed itself in the development of elaborate protocols for avoiding unwanted attention from the seven. Divine assemblies began incorporating formal procedures to ensure that their decisions would not inadvertently trigger Sebitti intervention. The Tablet of Divine Precautions lists 17 specific categories of action that gods were advised to avoid during periods when the Pleiades occupied certain positions in the night sky. The fear extended beyond practical concerns about uncontrolled destruction to reach deeper questions about the nature of divine authority itself. The Anunnaki derived their power from their positions within cosmic order, their ability to command respect from lesser beings, their capacity to shape reality through will and word. The Sebitti challenged all of these foundations simultaneously, demonstrating that true power might lie not in order, but in the capacity for controlled chaos, not in divine wisdom, but in mechanical precision, not in the complex relationships that bound the pantheon together, but in absolute independence from all such bonds. Mesopotamian theological texts from the Neo-Babylonian period reveal attempts by various gods to establish some form of relationship with the seven beyond simple fear and avoidance. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, allegedly attempted to seduce one of the Sebitti, calculating that emotional bonds might provide leverage over their actions. The attempt failed catastrophically. The targeted member of the seven proved entirely incapable of experiencing or responding to emotional manipulation. The incident, preserved in the text called Ishtar's Failed Conquest, describes the goddess's profound shock at encountering beings completely immune to the powers that made her irresistible to every other divine and mortal entity she had ever encountered. There is something quietly extraordinary about this detail, that even love, that most persistent of forces, could find no purchase against the seven. They were not cold exactly. They were simply elsewhere. Their attention moved in directions that no prayer or charm or beauty could redirect. Even Ishtar, standing in all the fullness of her terrible radiance, was for them simply part of the texture of a world they passed through on their way to some other destination. It is within this context that the figure of Era becomes particularly significant. Nergal's alter identity as Era represented the most actively destructive expression of divine authority, not merely the governance of death in the underworld, but direct intervention in the world of the living through plague, warfare, and societal collapse. The cuneiform tablets comprising the Epic of Era and Ishum, discovered in multiple copies across Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian sites, provide the most comprehensive surviving account of how this god of pestilence transformed the Sebitti from Anu's reserved instruments into active agents of systematic, methodical devastation. The epic begins with Era in a state of restless agitation, his weapons growing dull from disuse, his divine essence demanding violent expression. The text describes his awakening from prolonged dormancy, using language that evokes volcanic or seismic activity. This imagery establishes Era not as a calculating strategist, but as a force of nature, something that accumulates energy during periods of quiet and eventually requires discharge. The Sebitti appear in this context as the perfect instruments for channeling his chaotic impulses into directed campaigns against both divine and mortal targets. The relationship between Era and the Sebitti transcended simple command and obedience. Cuneiform grammatical analysis reveals that the epic consistently employs forms indicating reciprocal action rather than hierarchical direction. The seven do not merely obey Era's commands. They amplify and focus his destructive impulses, while he provides them with specific targets and tactical objectives. This symbiotic partnership created a feedback loop in which each entity enhanced the capabilities of the others, producing destructive potential that exceeded the sum of their individual powers. The combined force is described using the Akkadian phrase shutu shubu shutubu, overturning that causes overturning, suggesting cascading destruction that perpetuated itself beyond the initial intervention. The epic's detailed description of their first joint campaign reveals deeply sophisticated understanding of how coordinated divine intervention could systematically dismantle human civilization. Rather than the sudden and overwhelming destruction characteristic of flood narratives, Era and the Sebitti implemented a gradual process that began with the corruption of religious practice. They first targeted the priests and diviners who maintained communication between gods and mortals, introducing subtle errors into ritual procedures and causing omens to be misread. This initial phase created confusion and anxiety among human populations, while simultaneously dismantling the protective ceremonies that might otherwise have countered subsequent interventions. The second phase involved economic destabilization through systematic disruption of trade relationships. The Sebitti manifested their influence through a carefully orchestrated series of seemingly unrelated disasters. Caravan routes became impassable due to unseasonable storms. River transport failed when water levels fluctuated in unpredictable ways. Stored goods spoiled despite proper preservation. The epic provides specific examples. The seven could cause copper to corrode with unusual rapidity, cause grain to develop fungal infections that spread to healthy stores, cause textiles to deteriorate even when properly maintained and sheltered. These mounting economic pressures created exactly the social tensions needed to prepare the ground for more dramatic interventions. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with the historical events described in the epic reveals material correlations that are difficult to dismiss. Excavations at Tel Harmal, identified with ancient Sadupum, have uncovered destruction layers that align chronologically with the epic's narrative. The archaeological record at this site shows evidence of prolonged economic decline preceding any violent destruction, a gradual reduction in the quality and quantity of imported goods, deterioration of public buildings, changes in burial practices consistent with increasing social disruption. Most significantly, skeletal remains from the final occupation layer show clear evidence of epidemic disease affecting all social classes, supporting the epic's insistence that plague served as a primary weapon in the Era-Sebitti partnership. The coordination between Era's plague-bringing capacity and the individual specializations of the 7 created epidemic patterns of remarkable sophistication. Rather than introducing a single disease against which populations might gradually develop resistance, the combined campaigns employed sequential waves of different pathogens that prevented immune system adaptation. The epic describes this strategy through agricultural metaphor. First, the field is broken, then the seed is planted, then the harvest is reaped. The breaking phase weakened general health through initial illness. The planting phase introduced more virulent pathogens into already compromised populations. And the reaping phase brought psychological disorders that prevented organized response to the resulting crisis. Historical chronicles from the Neo-Assyrian period document specific instances in which royal scribes attributed military defeats and political collapses to Sebitti intervention. The Annals of Sennacherib describe the unexpected failure of the siege of Jerusalem in terms that strongly suggest perceived divine intervention by the 7, mentioning a plague that struck the Assyrian army with unprecedented speed and virulence, affecting soldiers who had shown no previous signs of illness. More significantly, the text describes the simultaneous appearance of 7 comets in the night sky during the siege, which court astronomers interpreted as unmistakable evidence of Sebitti activity. The Babylonian Chronicle series preserves accounts of the fall of the Assyrian Empire that attribute its rapid and comprehensive collapse to systematic Sebitti intervention. The chronicles describe a cascade of disasters, beginning with crop failures in the Assyrian heartland, followed by epidemic disease affecting both human and animal populations, and culminating in military rebellions that fragmented the empire's administrative structure. The speed and comprehensiveness of Assyria's collapse puzzled ancient observers who found conventional explanations inadequate. Modern historical analysis confirms patterns consistent with this systematic description. Archaeological evidence shows widespread abandonment of rural settlements beginning approximately 20 years before the final military defeats, suggesting prolonged demographic and economic pressure long before the armies ultimately broke. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of nutritional stress and epidemic disease affecting all social classes, indications of systemic rather than localized failure. The ritualistic responses to perceived Sebitti intervention evolved into one of the most complex and technically demanding branches of Mesopotamian religious practice. Kings and high priests developed elaborate ceremonies designed either to appease the 7 or to redirect their destructive attention toward enemy populations. The ritual of the 7 fires required the construction of 7 identical altars, arranged in the precise pattern of the Pleiades constellation, each receiving specific offerings corresponding to one of the Sebitti's areas of specialization. Weapons for the warrior aspect, diseased animals for the plague bringer, spoiled grain for the famine causer, broken pottery for the destroyer of cities. The diplomatic dimensions of these rituals reflect sophisticated understanding of the Sebitti as beings who could be negotiated with, rather than merely appeased through submission. The Tablet of Royal Supplication contains formulaic language for addressing the 7 as autonomous entities capable of independent decision-making, language not of command or entreaty, but of diplomatic correspondence between equal powers. Kings offered the Sebitti alternative targets for their destructive attention: enemy cities or rebellious provinces, in exchange for sparing their own territories. The success of these negotiations depended critically upon the accuracy of astronomical timing and the precision with which ritual procedures were executed. State-sponsored ceremonies for managing Sebitti intervention required unprecedented coordination between royal, priestly, and military authorities. The Protocol for Divine Warfare outlines procedures for implementing these rituals during active military campaigns, specifying that attempts to redirect the Seven's attention toward enemy forces required simultaneous action by the king, performing specific incantations, the high priest conducting sacrificial ceremonies, and military commanders positioning their troops in formations corresponding to stellar configurations. The complexity of these requirements meant that successful implementation demanded months of advanced planning and flawless coordination among multiple institutions. Historical records document both the successes and failures of these diplomatic approaches. The Annals of Nebuchadnezzar II describe a campaign against Judah in which Babylonian priests performed ceremonies designed to focus the Sebitti's destructive attention upon Jerusalem rather than upon Babylon. Contemporary records from the siege describe the systematic breakdown of Jerusalem's defenses through a combination of military pressure, epidemic disease, and internal political collapse that precisely matches the patterns associated with Sebitti intervention. By contrast, the failure of identical procedures during the Persian conquest of Babylon demonstrates the limitations of even the most sophisticated ritualistic approaches to managing cosmic forces. Cuneiform tablets from the final years of the Neo-Babylonian Empire describe increasingly desperate attempts by Nabonidus and his priests to invoke Sebitti protection against Cyrus's advancing armies. The rituals were performed with unprecedented elaboration, drawing upon the resources of the entire empire. They achieved nothing. Babylon fell. The integration of Sebitti-focused rituals into regular state religious practice created permanent institutional changes within the Mesopotamian priesthood. Specialized colleges of priests developed expertise in astronomical observation, ritual timing, and the complex procedures required for divine warfare ceremonies. These specialists, known as Barusha Ilu Sebitti, occupied positions of significant influence within royal courts, advising kings on when to initiate military campaigns, how to respond to natural disasters, and which diplomatic approaches might prove effective with foreign powers. The existence of these institutional roles demonstrates how deeply the concept of manageable cosmic destruction became embedded in Mesopotamian political culture. In the long hours of the night, when the palace corridors were quiet and the fires burned low, it must have been these specialists who stayed awake, comparing observations, checking calculations against the records of their predecessors, tracing the slow arc of the Pleiades across the sky, and reading in their movement something like a message, written in a language that required decades to learn and a lifetime to master. They were custodians of a very old fear, and they carried it with a kind of dignity. The astronomical precision with which Mesopotamian observers tracked the Sebitti through their stellar manifestation, as the Pleiades reveals a level of scientific sophistication that challenges conventional assumptions about ancient knowledge systems. Cuneiform tablets from the Neo-Babylonian astronomical archives demonstrate that court astronomers could predict the cluster's heliacal rising to within a single day, calculate its angular position relative to other celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy, and correlate these measurements with terrestrial events spanning decades of accumulated observation. The star catalog, known as MUL.APIN, compiled during the 7th century BCE, but incorporating observations dating back over a millennium, provides mathematical formulas for calculating the cluster's position throughout the year that remain accurate by modern standards. The identification of the Sebitti with this particular star cluster was not arbitrary, but reflected deep understanding of the Pleiades' unique astronomical characteristics. Unlike most stellar groupings visible to the naked eye, the cluster exhibits an apparent internal motion that varies seasonally, creating the impression of activity and coordination within the constellation. Babylonian astronomers recorded these variations using a sophisticated system of angular measurements that divided the ecliptic into precise degrees and documented the cluster's position relative to fixed reference points throughout the night sky. Their observations revealed that the Pleiades appear to dance in formation, individual stars seeming to shift position relative to each other across different seasons, a phenomenon that reinforced the cluster's identification with the dynamic and coordinated nature of the Sebitti. The mathematical models underlying these predictions employed geometric calculations that treated the cluster as a dynamic system rather than a fixed configuration. Cuneiform tablets from the astronomical school at Uruk preserve computational methods for calculating the cluster's position at any given date, accounting for seasonal variations, atmospheric conditions, and the observer's geographical location. These calculations required understanding of spherical trigonometry and coordinate transformation that would not be formally recognized by European astronomy until the Renaissance period. The integration of Pleiades observations with other celestial phenomena, lunar phases, planetary positions, eclipse cycles, created comprehensive astrological systems capable of predicting complex chains of cause and effect across multiple domains of human activity simultaneously. The seasonal festivals associated with Sebitti worship demonstrate how astronomical knowledge became woven into agricultural and religious cycles throughout Mesopotamian society. The Festival of the Rising Stars began each year when the Pleiades achieved their heliacal rising, marking the transition from the agricultural dormancy of winter to the active growing season. This celebration unfolded across 7 days of ceremonies, one for each visible star in the cluster, each day dedicated to propitiating a specific member of the Sebitti through particular offerings and ritual procedures. The timing of these festivals required precise astronomical calculation. Beginning even a single day too early or too late was believed to anger the seven and invite exactly the attention one was hoping to avoid. Agricultural applications of Sebitti astronomy extended beyond simple calendar keeping into sophisticated understanding of how stellar positions affected crop growth and livestock reproduction. Farming manuals from the Neo-Babylonian period specify optimal planting dates calculated from Pleiades positions, with different crops requiring different stellar configurations for maximum yield. Barley planting achieved best results when initiated 3 days after the cluster's heliacal rising. Date palm cultivation required waiting until the Pleiades reached specific angular positions relative to the Bull of Heaven constellation. Veterinary texts from temple archives at Sippar describe breeding programs for temple livestock that synchronized mating cycles with specific Pleiades configurations, noting that cattle bred when the cluster appeared at its brightest produced offspring with superior disease resistance. There is something almost tender in this. The idea that ancient farmers and herders oriented the most intimate rhythms of their lives, the planting of seeds, the mating of animals, the birth of children, around the slow turning of a distant star cluster. The seven who inspired such terror in the gods were also woven into the fabric of daily life in ways almost too quiet to notice. The fear and the calendar were, in the end, made of the same material. Medical applications of Sebitti astronomy created diagnostic and therapeutic systems that correlated disease patterns with stellar observation. Physicians trained in astronomical medicine could predict epidemic outbreaks by monitoring changes in Pleiades brightness and configuration, enabling preventive measures that significantly reduced mortality rates during plague seasons. The diagnostic handbook compiled by the physician Esagilkin Apli includes detailed instructions for timing medical treatments according to Pleiades positions, with certain procedures proving most effective during specific stellar configurations and others best avoided when the cluster occupied unfavorable positions. Military applications of Pleiades observation developed into comprehensive strategic systems. Campaign planning incorporated astronomical timing that synchronized troop movements with favorable Sebitti configurations, while deliberately avoiding periods when the Seven might intervene against military operations. The Manual of Divine Warfare specifies that siege operations should be initiated when the Pleiades occupy the eastern quadrant of the night sky, while defensive preparations achieve maximum effectiveness when begun during the cluster's western transit. Diplomatic applications enabled Mesopotamian rulers to time negotiations and treaty signings for maximum strategic advantage, with ambassadors receiving detailed astronomical briefings before departing on sensitive missions. Treaties concluded during favorable Sebitti periods proved remarkably durable. Agreements finalized during unfavorable stellar positions frequently collapsed within months of ratification. The economic applications of Pleiades observation created trading systems that maximized profit while managing risk through astronomical timing of commercial activities. Merchant guilds employed astronomers to calculate optimal departure dates for trading expeditions, with caravans leaving when Pleiades configurations favored safe travel and profitable exchange. The Chronicle of Merchant Ventures documents how traders following astronomical timing achieved success rates nearly double those of competitors who ignored stellar factors, leading to widespread adoption of Sebitti-based commercial planning throughout the ancient Near East. The technological innovations driven by Sebitti astronomy included the development of water clocks, sundials, and other timekeeping instruments capable of maintaining accuracy across seasonal variations in daylight. These devices enabled precise coordination of ritual activities with astronomical events, ensuring that ceremonies honoring the Seven occurred at exactly the correct moments. The architectural implications of Pleiades observation influenced the design and orientation of temples, palaces, and entire cities. The Ziggurat of Babylon incorporated 7 levels, corresponding to the 7 visible stars in the cluster, each level oriented to frame the cluster during specific seasons. The royal palace at Nineveh included observation chambers with precisely calculated window placements that allowed astronomers to track the Pleiades movements throughout the year without leaving the building. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that ziggurat, its 7 great steps rising in the blue Babylonian dusk, each terrace planted with trees and herbs that catch the last warm light, the whole vast structure humming quietly with the accumulated intention of the people who built it. At its highest point, a priest stands alone with his instruments, his back to the city below, his face turned toward the darkening east where the Pleiades will rise, as they always rise, as they rose before this city existed, and will rise after its last stone has been swallowed by the desert. The transmission of Sebitti concepts across the ancient Near East occurred through networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that connected Mesopotamian civilization with neighboring societies across a vast geographical expanse. Cuneiform tablets from the Kul-Tepe merchant archives, dating to the Old Assyrian period, document extensive commercial relationships between Mesopotamian traders and Anatolian city-states, revealing how religious concepts traveled alongside goods and technologies. Merchants who established permanent colonies throughout Anatolia carried with them not only textiles and metals, but the astronomical knowledge and ritual practices associated with the seven. Archaeological evidence from MUL.APIN shows a Syrian merchant quarter equipped with astronomical observation platforms and inscribed tablets describing Pleiades-based timing for commercial ventures, demonstrating how Sebitti concepts became integrated into international business practices at a remarkably early date. The Hurrian adaptation of Mesopotamian septenary divine concepts produced distinctive variations that reflected local theological concerns while maintaining core structural elements. Hurrian texts from Nusi and other sites described 7 storm gods known as the Tub Seven, who served the weather god in capacities remarkably similar to the Sebitti. These divine warriors manifested through meteorological phenomena, bringing hail, lightning, and destructive winds against enemies of the Hurrian kingdoms. The Hurrian version emphasized their role as protectors of royal authority rather than cosmic enforcers, suggesting adaptation of Mesopotamian concepts to serve more localized political needs. Hurrian cylinder seals depict these 7 storm gods in formations similar to Mesopotamian representations of the Sebitti, but carrying specifically meteorological weapons rather than the abstract instruments of cosmic destruction associated with their Mesopotamian predecessors. The integration of Sebitti concepts into Hurrian religious practice influenced the development of Mitannian royal ideology during the 15th and 14th centuries. BCE. Royal inscriptions from Mitannian kings describe their authority as derived from the 7 who ride the storm clouds, suggesting that Hurrian rulers claimed divine legitimacy through association with their adapted version of the Sebitti. This political application of septenary divine concepts created precedents that would later influence Neo-Assyrian royal ideology, as Assyrian kings incorporated similar language into their own inscriptions describing divine support for their military campaigns. Hittite archives from Bogaskoi preserve extensive correspondence with Mesopotamian courts, revealing sophisticated understanding of Sebitti-related astronomical phenomena among Anatolian royal astronomers. Hittite treaties with Assyrian and Babylonian rulers include clauses specifying that certain diplomatic activities should avoid periods when the 7 stars of Anu occupied particular positions in the night sky. These diplomatic protocols demonstrate that Hittite rulers recognized the importance of Sebitti astronomy in Mesopotamian political culture and adapted their own practices accordingly. Evidence that septenary divine concepts had achieved sufficient international recognition to influence diplomatic procedure across significant cultural boundaries. The Ugaritic pantheon incorporated septenary divine groupings showing clear structural parallels to the Mesopotamian Sebitti while adapting to local mythological frameworks. The Baal cycle describes 7 divine warriors assisting the storm god in his battles against Yam and Mot, cosmic forces representing chaos and death. These Ugaritic 7 carry weapons forged from meteoric iron and can manifest as both atmospheric phenomena and stellar configurations. Their coordination in battle emphasizes perfect synchronization rather than individual heroism, mirroring the collective nature of their Mesopotamian counterparts. Archaeological excavations at Ras Shamra have uncovered cult objects arranged in groups of 7, miniature weapons and star-shaped amulets that suggest ritual practices focused on invoking these divine warriors. The Ugaritic adaptation retains astronomical associations, with ritual texts describing ceremonies timed to specific stellar configurations, but shifts primary loyalty from Anu to Baal, reflecting the different theological priorities of Canaanite religion, while preserving the essential structure of coordinated divine forces operating beyond normal pantheon hierarchies. Egyptian religious texts from the New Kingdom describe divine groupings exhibiting striking parallels to Mesopotamian septenary concepts, suggesting cultural transmission through the diplomatic and commercial contacts of that era. The 7 arrows of Sekhmet appear in medical papyri as disease-bringing entities serving the lioness goddess in her role as bringer of epidemic plague. Each of the 7 arrows possesses individual names and specializations, targeting different types of illness and different demographic groups. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes them as the 7 who know no mercy, language remarkably close to Mesopotamian descriptions of the Sebitti, as forces immune to appeal or negotiation. Egyptian astronomical texts from the Ramesside period identify these 7 divine entities with specific stars that appear to correspond to the Pleiades cluster, and the timing of rituals associated with Sekhmet's arrows closely parallels Mesopotamian Sebitti ceremonies, both traditions emphasizing the critical importance of stellar position in determining when these divine forces are active or dormant. The medical applications of Egyptian septenary divine concepts reveal sophisticated understanding of epidemic disease patterns that parallels Mesopotamian plague lore associated with the Sebitti. The Ebers Papyrus describes 7 distinct types of fever corresponding to Sekhmet's arrows, each requiring different therapeutic approaches, and each following predictable progression patterns. Egyptian physicians could diagnose which of the 7 arrows had struck a patient by observing symptom development, enabling targeted treatments that achieved success rates superior to general therapeutic approaches. This medical system demonstrates how septenary divine concepts could be adapted to serve practical healing purposes while maintaining their theological significance. The 7 scorpion goddesses who protected Isis during her flight after Osiris's death represent another Egyptian adaptation of septenary divine concepts, though with protective rather than destructive functions. These 7 deities coordinate their actions to shield Isis from Set's persecution, demonstrating the same perfect synchronization characteristic of Mesopotamian Sebitti, but applied to defensive rather than offensive purposes. The scorpion goddesses possess individual names and specializations, each responsible for protecting against different types of threats. Their astronomical associations remain less clearly defined than those of Sekhmet's arrows, but ritual texts suggest they were also connected to specific stellar configurations that determined their periods of greatest activity. Canaanite religious practices, documented in biblical and extra-biblical sources, contain references to septenary divine councils that exhibit structural similarities to Mesopotamian septenary concepts. The divine council described in Psalm 82 consists of 7 divine beings who serve as administrators of cosmic justice, capable of independent decision-making, but ultimately accountable to the supreme deity. The prophetic literature of ancient Israel contains numerous references to 7 divine agents who execute judgment against nations and individuals. The Book of Revelation's 7 angels, who pour out bowls of wrath, represent a later development of these concepts. Earlier prophetic texts describe similar groupings of 7 enforcers. The Book of Zechariah's 7 eyes of the Lord, ranging throughout the earth, divine observers who monitor human behavior and report back for judgment, suggests that septenary divine concepts had become sufficiently widespread in ancient Near Eastern culture to influence Israelite theology, and, through it, the apocalyptic imagination of early Christianity. Persian religious concepts documented in Avestan texts describe 7 divine entities, known as the Amesha Spentas, who serve Ahura Mazda as administrators of cosmic order. These 7 holy immortals possess individual names and specialized functions governing different aspects of creation, including earth, water, fire, metal, cattle, plants, and humans. Their coordination in maintaining cosmic order parallels the coordinated action of Mesopotamian Sebitti, though their functions emphasize preservation and creation rather than destruction. The theological differences between Persian and Mesopotamian septenary concepts reflect the distinct cosmological frameworks of Zoroastrian and Mesopotamian religion. Where the Sebitti operated as instruments of divine wrath within a polytheistic system that accepted destruction as necessary for cosmic balance, the Amesha functioned as creative forces within a dualistic system that emphasized the struggle between good and evil. This adaptation demonstrates how septenary divine concepts could be modified to serve radically different theological purposes while maintaining their essential structure as coordinated divine agents operating under supreme authority. Greek sources from the classical period preserve references to septenary divine groupings that suggest continued transmission of ancient Near Eastern concepts through cultural exchange networks. The Seven Against Thebes legend, while ostensibly describing human heroes, exhibits structural parallels to divine warrior groups that suggest mythological origins in earlier septenary traditions. The coordination of the seven heroes, their individual specializations, and their role as agents of cosmic justice operating beyond normal political constraints all mirror characteristics of Mesopotamian Sebitti. The mystery schools of the Hellenistic period incorporated septenary symbolism that drew upon ancient Near Eastern traditions while adapting them to Greek philosophical frameworks, with 7 grades of initiation corresponding to 7 planetary deities, the highest associated with Saturn representing completion of the spiritual journey. The transmission of septenary concepts into early Christian theology occurred through multiple channels including Jewish apocalyptic literature, Hellenistic mystery traditions, and direct contact with ancient Near Eastern religious practices. The Book of Revelation's extensive use of septenary symbolism demonstrates sophisticated understanding of earlier traditions while adapting them to Christian theological concerns. The 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls of wrath all reflect structural patterns established in Mesopotamian Sebitti traditions, though their functions serve Christian eschatological purposes rather than ancient Near Eastern cosmic enforcement. Gnostic systems of the early Christian period incorporated septenary concepts showing clear continuity with ancient Near Eastern traditions. The 7 archons described in various Gnostic texts function as cosmic administrators who control different aspects of material existence, coordinated in maintaining the material prison that traps divine sparks within matter. Their influence is mediated through planetary and stellar configurations. The underlying structure remains recognizable, even as the function shifts from ancient Near Eastern divine enforcement to Gnostic cosmological architecture. The persistence of septenary warrior motifs in Mediterranean folk traditions throughout the classical and post-classical periods demonstrates the deep cultural impact of these ancient concepts. Folk tales from multiple Mediterranean cultures describe groups of 7 heroes, or supernatural beings who coordinate their actions to achieve objectives beyond individual capability. Stories that preserve structural elements of ancient septenary divine concepts while adapting them to local narrative traditions. The astronomical associations of these folk traditions often remain implicit, but the seasonal timing of associated festivals and ritual practices suggests continued awareness of stellar dimensions inherited from earlier religious frameworks. There is something deeply comforting in this long thread of transmission, the way a concept born in the reed-grown marshes of ancient Sumer could travel through Hurrian mountain kingdoms and Canaanite coastal cities and Egyptian temple complexes and Greek philosophical schools and early Christian communities and medieval Islamic scholarship and Renaissance Hermeticism changing its costume at each stop, but never quite losing the shape of what it had always been. 7. Coordinated. Beyond the reach of ordinary authority. Watching from the stars. The rediscovery of the Sebitti in 19th century European occult literature coincided with the archaeological excavations that were returning Mesopotamian civilization to Western consciousness for the first time since antiquity. Paul Botter's work at Dur Sharukin and Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nineveh provided European scholars with their first systematic exposure to cuneiform texts containing references to the seven. The incomplete state of cuneiform translation during this period created fertile ground for speculative interpretations that often diverged dramatically from scholarly reconstruction. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1888, incorporated what they believed to be Sebitti concepts into their elaborate ceremonial magic system. Though their understanding derived primarily from classical rather than direct cuneiform sources, Golden Dawn manuscripts describe the seven as primordial forces that could be invoked through astronomical timing and complex symbolic correspondences, transforming ancient agents of cosmic enforcement into tools for individual spiritual development and magical operation. Aleister Crowley's engagement with Mesopotamian septenary concepts occurred during his extensive study of ancient religious systems. His unpublished notebooks from the early 1900s contain detailed analysis of cuneiform texts describing the Sebitti, though his interpretations were heavily shaped by his own magical theories. He identified the seven with what he termed stellar intelligences, contactable through ritual procedures performed during optimal astronomical conditions. His Aeon of Horus incorporated septenary symbolism, drawn explicitly from Mesopotamian sources, transforming the ancient concept of divine enforcement into a progressive historical force that would clear away obsolete religious and social structures in preparation for new forms of human consciousness. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 20th century gradually provided more accurate understanding of ancient Mesopotamian religious practices, revealing significant discrepancies between scholarly reconstruction and occult interpretation. Wilfred Lambert's decipherment of the Epic of Era in the 1960s demonstrated that the seven functioned as instruments of systematic destruction, rather than tools for individual magical operation. The Temple of Set, founded by Michael Aquino in 1975, developed one of the more historically informed modern interpretations, drawing directly upon scholarly translations of cuneiform sources, and emphasizing the seven's function as agents of cosmic disruption, interpreting this role as analogous to the left-hand path's emphasis on individual separation from conventional constraints. Contemporary chaos magic practitioners have incorporated Sebitti concepts into experimental approaches to magical practice, viewing the seven as archetypal forces capable of disrupting established patterns and creating conditions for radical transformation, demonstrating greater understanding of the Sebitti's genuinely destructive nature, while adapting their function to serve modern purposes. The discovery of the Enuma Anu Enlil series in the early 20th century revolutionized scholarly understanding of Mesopotamian astronomical observation and its integration with religious practice. These texts revealed that ancient Mesopotamian astronomers possessed mathematical capabilities and observational precision that exceeded European astronomy until the Renaissance period. The detailed correlation between Pleiades observations and terrestrial events documented in these sources demonstrated that Sebitti worship involved sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics rather than primitive star worship, challenging earlier scholarly assumptions about ancient Near Eastern religion. Carbon 14. Dating of organic materials from archaeological sites associated with Sebitti worship has provided chronological frameworks that support textual evidence for the antiquity and geographical spread of septenary divine concepts. Samples from ritual deposits at Babylon, Nineveh, and other major Mesopotamian centers confirm continuous religious activity focused on septenary symbolism, spanning over 2 millennia from the Old Babylonian period through the Seleucid era. This archaeological evidence demonstrates the remarkable persistence of Sebitti worship across multiple political and cultural transformations of Mesopotamian civilization. Recent archaeological investigations at Tel Hariri have uncovered extensive evidence of ritual activities specifically designed to manage Sebitti intervention in human affairs. Excavations have revealed 7 identical ritual chambers arranged in the pattern of the Pleiades constellation, each containing specialized equipment for astronomical observation and ceremonial offerings. The precision of the astronomical alignments incorporated into this complex demonstrates sophisticated understanding of stellar mechanics that required generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation. The discovery of cuneiform tablets within these chambers has provided new insights into the practical implementation of Sebitti-focused religious practices. Spectroscopic analysis of metal objects recovered from Sebitti cult sites has revealed unusual alloy compositions that correspond to ancient textual descriptions of star metal used in ceremonies honoring the Seven. These artifacts contain elevated concentrations of rare earth elements typically associated with meteoric sources, suggesting that ancient practitioners specifically sought materials of celestial origin for their rituals. The technical sophistication required to identify and work these unusual metals indicates that Sebitti worship involved specialized metallurgical knowledge that extended beyond conventional religious practice into what might be termed ancient material science. The ongoing scholarly debate regarding the historical versus mythological reality of the Sebitti reflects fundamental questions about the nature of ancient religious experience and the relationship between symbolic and literal truth in pre-modern cultures. Maximalist interpretations argue that ancient Mesopotamian texts describe actual encounters with non-human intelligences, pointing to the consistency of accounts across multiple centuries and geographical regions as evidence for objective reality behind the mythological narratives. Minimalist approaches treat the accounts as purely symbolic expressions of natural phenomena and social anxieties, emphasizing the human tendency to personify cosmic forces and project psychological conflicts onto divine narratives. The astronomical precision documented in ancient observations of the Pleiades cluster provides compelling evidence that at least some aspects of Sebitti lore derived from careful empirical observation, rather than pure imagination. Modern astronomical calculations confirm the accuracy of ancient predictions regarding the cluster's position and behavior, suggesting that Mesopotamian astronomers possessed genuine understanding of celestial mechanics that informed their religious interpretations. The correlation between documented historical events and predicted periods of Sebitti activity demonstrates that ancient practitioners achieved practical results through their astronomical timing systems, regardless of the ultimate reality of the divine beings they claim to serve. Comparative analysis of septenary divine concepts across multiple ancient cultures reveals structural patterns suggesting either common historical origins or universal psychological archetypes underlying human religious experience. The widespread appearance of sevenfold divine groupings in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Canaanite, Persian, and other ancient traditions indicates that septenary symbolism possessed cross-cultural significance transcending any single mythological framework. The consistency of certain characteristics, coordination, astronomical association, enforcement function, independence from conventional authority. Across these diverse traditions suggests underlying patterns that shaped human perception of cosmic forces throughout the ancient world. Modern psychological research into archetypal symbolism has identified septenary patterns as fundamental structures within human consciousness that emerge independently across different cultural contexts. Carl Jung's analysis of septenary symbolism in dreams, mythology, and religious experience revealed consistent associations with completion, transformation, and cosmic order, paralleling ancient Mesopotamian conceptions of the Sebitti's function. This research suggests that ancient septenary divine concepts may have reflected genuine insights into structures of human consciousness and its relationship to cosmic patterns, providing a bridge between mythological and scientific understanding of these phenomena that we are only now beginning to appreciate. The implications of Sebitti worship for understanding ancient concepts of divine power extend beyond specific religious practices to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of cosmic order and human agency within larger universal systems. The Mesopotamian conception of divine beings who operated outside conventional authority structures introduced concepts of autonomous cosmic force that would later influence the development of monotheistic traditions. The Sebitti's function as enforcers of cosmic law, operating beyond normal divine politics, provided conceptual frameworks for understanding divine justice that transcended local political arrangements and cultural limitations. Frameworks that persisted in transformed but recognizable forms for millennia. The persistence of septenary symbolism in contemporary religious and esoteric traditions demonstrates the continued relevance of ancient Mesopotamian insights into the structure of cosmic order and divine authority. Modern interpretations may differ significantly from their ancient predecessors in terms of specific content and application, but the underlying recognition of coordinated cosmic forces operating beyond human control or comprehension remains constant across 4,000 years of cultural development. The Sebitti's legacy extends from ancient Mesopotamian astronomy through medieval Islamic science, Renaissance Hermeticism, modern occultism, and contemporary chaos magic, a continuous thread of human engagement with cosmic forces that transcend conventional religious and cultural boundaries. The seven who once terrified even the gods continue to challenge human understanding of our place within cosmic order, serving as eternal reminders that beneath the apparent stability of civilization lie forces of transformation and renewal that operate according to principles beyond human comprehension or control. Their story, preserved in cuneiform tablets buried for millennia beneath the desert sands of Mesopotamia, speaks to fundamental questions about power, authority, and cosmic justice that remain as alive today as they were 4,000 years ago, when scribes first pressed their styluses into wet clay to record those terrible names. In an age when humanity again confronts the possibility of forces reshaping the very foundations of existence, the ancient wisdom of the Sebitti offers both a warning and a kind of strange guidance. A reminder of the eternal dance between order and chaos that has always defined our cosmic condition. Those tablets are still being read. Those stars are still rising. Somewhere tonight, the Pleiades are visible above a dark horizon, their soft light unchanged, their slow motion through the sky as patient and precise as it has always been. Whatever the seven were, or are, or represent, they remain woven into the oldest layers of human understanding, into the first attempts to look up at the night sky and find there not merely light, but meaning, not merely pattern, but intention. We inherit all of this without knowing it. It lives in the structures of our oldest stories, in the way certain numbers feel complete to us, in the quiet unease that some people feel on clear nights when the stars are very bright and the world is very still. And now, let the story rest gently there, like clay drying in the evening air, like stars settling into their slow orbits overhead. You have traveled far tonight, through ancient temples and starlit skies, through the deep deliberations of gods and the quiet work of scribes long returned to dust. Let all of it drift away now, softly, like smoke rising from a dying fire. Your body is heavy and warm. Your breath is slow and easy. The stars outside are turning in their ancient patterns, just as they always have, just as they always will. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight. Only rest, only stillness, only the deep and quiet dark. Good night and sleep well.